off with Dr. Emma Shortis. Emma teaches at RMIT. We first became aware of Emma's work with the publication of her book, Our Exceptional Friend. Just going to make sure I get it right. I read the book and it's a fabulous book. And we're very pleased to have her here again this morning, and thank her for coming all the way from Victoria to attend the conference. Emma.
Thank you again. Thank you so much for inviting me here. We've been asked this morning to talk a little bit about rising aggression and the narratives around China and the situation in the Asia Pacific. And I'm very aware that I'm not in fact an expert on China or Australia's relationship with China. My focus is on Australia's alliance with the United States. So I thought I would start by, I suppose, setting a little historical context for the kind of narratives and building aggression that we are watching happen today, and really the work that the alliance does, that the ANZUS Treaty does in particular, to support and to normalise that aggression, and particularly I think the work that it does to obscure complexity in particular, and to normalise both racism and a particular way of understanding international relations, of understanding the world. So I'll start with I guess obscuring and the question of the narratives that are built up around the alliance that help support the kind of aggression that we just heard about, whether it's directed at individuals or directed at entire nations. You know, David kind of mentioned yesterday the continuation of the rhetoric and the aggression towards China from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. And of course, I think he's absolutely right about that. But Biden, of course, framed that aggression and continues to frame that aggression quite differently. And from the beginning of his presidency and even his campaign, he framed his approach to China in particular, but to international relations and later Russia, as this kind of framework of democracy versus autocracy. So the democracies of the world lining up against evil autocracies. And that's kind of his framing, and that understands and I guess promotes an understanding of the world as particularly fixed, that we will always be democracies and we will always be lined up against these particular autocracies, which of course flattens the experience of people within both of those categories. Our own Prime Minister at the time kind of took it a little bit further. You might remember when Scott Morrison talked about the arc of autocracy, which was a kind of interesting Bushism. But again, this is an example of the way that Australia supports kind of American narratives and American aggression. Now, this narrative, Biden's kind of initial narrative of democracy versus autocracy, was actually met with a great deal of skepticism in Europe, and of course in Asia as well, because a lot of those countries kind of know what that means when the Americans start talking about the inherent goodness of democracy versus the inherent evil of autocracy. But it wasn't met with any kind of skepticism, I don't think, in the mainstream, at least here in Australia. It was kind of assumed this is a normal state of affairs, it's us goody democracies versus the rest of the world. And that kind of normalisation, that obscuring of complexity, is really actually very dangerous for us, because what it means is that many Australians, and our governments in particular, are blinded to the dangers of that kind of framing, and blinded to, in particular in this case, the instability of the American democratic system. And this, I think there's kind of been again, a sigh of relief after the US midterms around the state of American democracy, but I would argue that the danger is still there. And for me, that danger is really encapsulated in one particular moment that I think, again, kind of didn't get a huge amount of attention. But some of you may have seen that during the January 6th insurrection in the Capitol in the US, of course, a lot of attention was paid to former Vice President Mike Pence. And, you know, the fact that there was a gallows erected out of the front of the Capitol for Mike Pence, and the mob missed him by a matter of seconds, you know, a matter of meters. You may have even seen the footage where Mike Pence is kind of running out the door, and then a few seconds later the mob comes after him. And we know what would have happened if they'd got to him. They were very clear about that, and they were very clear about Nancy Pelosi as well. But what many people don't know, or didn't get a lot of attention, is that the Vice President at all times is followed, of course, by a Secret Service contingent and a backup of the nuclear football. You know, the button that follows the president around all the time. The Vice President has a backup, and it follows him everywhere that he goes. During the insurrection on the Capitol, the military actually lost track of the backup nuclear football. For more than an hour, they didn't know where it was. And they didn't even know that they didn't know where it was until several months later, when some footage was shown at a congressional hearing. This was kind of explained away. You know, there were 1 or 2 CNN articles about it, about how no, it's fine, you know, it's really encrypted, it's only the backup, like it was never actually in any danger, don't worry about it. And I just can't, I mean, I don't know about you, but that defies belief to me. And I think here in Australia, given our deep enmeshment with the United States military industrial complex, we need to think through what it means if historical contingency turns out a little bit differently and they do get Mike Pence, or they do get the nuclear football. What are the implications of that for us? What happens? You know, we talk so often about the danger of Chinese or Russian hacking and all the architecture and all the plans that we have in place for those kind of attacks on the integrity of our democracy and on the integrity of our political decision-making systems. But we don't talk about those kind of dangers and what that would mean, what the implications of that would be for us should that go a little bit differently. And again, you know, that is an extreme example, but there are so many contingencies, I think, and instabilities built into the American electoral system that the possibility of that kind of thing going wrong is actually really high. Historians talk about contingency all the time, and I think, again, it's kind of worth noting that, you know, American democracy so far has survived Donald Trump, and the midterm election result was really, really heartening. But the nature of the American electoral system means that it can only really take 1 or 2 people to sow absolute chaos through the American political system and American democracy. You know, what happens if next time Donald Trump calls the Secretary of State of Georgia and says, I need you to find me 11,000 votes so that I can win this election? What happens if next time that Secretary of State in Georgia, or maybe in Arizona, says, yeah, sure, okay, no worries, we'll find it and we'll overturn an election? What choices does the Australian government have in that scenario? What are the implications for our security enmeshment, for our joint defence facilities that Richard I'm sure will speak about? We're not thinking these things through, and I don't think that DFAT is making the kind of contingency plans that it should be making for such a scenario, and thinking through, you know, gaming through, as we do in international relations, what the scenarios are there. So there's that kind of obscuring, I think, that happens all the time. And then at the same time, what the Alliance does is kind of normalising this way of seeing the world around us being goodies. There's no complexity in that. And then the baddies being the autocrats, and particularly being non-white autocrats. And that's a kind of foundational feature of the ANZUS Treaty. And I spoke about that a little bit yesterday. And it functions, I suppose, to treat American domestic politics and the Alliance, our domestic politics, as something completely separate. You know, the Alliance sits on its own, and it's treated not only as separate, but as inevitable. It's a historical inevitability because we have democracies, we have shared values, and so it's an obvious thing that was always going to happen. That it goes back to that kind of what's the alternative question I was speaking about yesterday. You know, who else is going to protect us? The US is the obvious answer, and even going back to the UK is the obvious answer. And part of that desire, or a huge part of that history and that desire, is racialised. Of course it's racialised. Australian white governments seek out the protection of big white empires like the UK and the United States because our governments are continually and deeply aware that we are living on stolen land, and they are afraid that that land is going to be stolen back by people who don't look like them. And again, that's a feature. And it was part of the reason, of course, that Australia sought out the ANZUS Alliance in the first place. It was a fear. It was, of course, a racialized fear of Japan. But again, that in our kind of narratives of ANZUS and the history of the treaty, seeking out protection from Japan is seen as obvious. Of course, Australia would need to seek out protection from Japan, but what that obscures is that by the time the ANZUS Treaty was actually signed in 1951, Japan posed no threat to Australia, absolutely none. And everybody knew that. And in fact, one of the reasons the Americans conceded to the ANZUS Treaty was because the Australian government was refusing to support the Americans signing a peace treaty with Japan. That's part of the reason they gave us ANZUS, because they wanted us to support that peace treaty with Japan. So ANZUS really sets us up to see the world in this way, to see it as especially to see our North as full of racialized enemies, and to see the only option as protection from another big white power. And it sets us up to respond to the world in that kind of framing, and to respond particularly with fear and aggression rather than peace building. And again, this is presented to us as a historical inevitability. But I just, as I finish up, because I actually am running out of time, wanted to draw attention to the fact that nothing is inevitable. Because at the same time that ANZUS is being negotiated and being signed in Europe, where, you know, enemies, existential enemies that had been at war with each other and in conflict for centuries, are beginning the work of building what would become the European Union. They are integrating their economies. They are doing the really incredibly hard work of peace building and ensuring that conflict doesn't ever happen again on the European continent. Our government made the choice not to do that, and that was a choice. It wasn't an inevitability. And I wanted to draw attention to that to show that we do in fact have choices, and that war in particular is not inevitable.